What you've got to do, if you're on a solo show and you're telling a story about your life, you got to make you the hero, and you got to take people on the hero's journey. Now, there's a lot of hero's journey frameworks out there. I'm going to give you the exact script that I use. This is a blend of stuff I've learned from Joseph Campbell, Hero with 1,000 Faces, Donald Miller, Story Brand, researching Pixar and how they tell their stories. And I read stuff about stories all the time because, if you go to shanesams.com, you're going to see it says I'm a podcaster and a storyteller. Like, I love to tell stories. I love to hear people's stories. That's why I love the medium of podcasting so much. And this is the framework I use whether I'm telling a story or I interview. This is the exact framework I used last week when I interviewed Priscilla Shire. It's the same story I use when I interview anybody. It can be shortened and lengthened. If you got an hour and a half, or if you got 30 minutes, you can use a framework like this. And these are just some things that I like to do. All right, when you're interviewing a guest or you're telling a story, you always want to start with once upon a time, right? I mean, that's what it is, man. Like, once upon a time, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Like, long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. Like, great stories start with once upon a time. Who were you? What were you doing before the story started? I was a school teacher in Southeast Kentucky once upon a time, right? You got to start with once upon a time because you got to set the stage for the catalyst. You got to set the stage for the catalyst. You got to say what caused you to move. What causes Frodo to leave the Shire? What caused Priscilla Shire to go into writing? What caused Dean Graziosi to start buying ads and start buying infomercials? Like, what was happening before that even made you think to do this? If you'll start your podcast, don't say once upon a time, but you can say things like, hey, take me back to before you were successful. Let me go back to before I was an entrepreneur, right? Let me go back to when I was an 0-10 football coach before I became an 8-2 football coach. You can take people back and set the stage. You really want to do a prologue or a once upon a time or something so that people know this person isn't a superhero, right? If you just start with people's story where they're at now, you frame your guest as a superhero. And your listeners will say, I can't do that. This person's special, right? But if you go back far enough and you go back long enough, you'll realize, wait, nobody's special. We just have special circumstances that propelled us forward, okay? So we always start with once upon a time, we set the setting, okay? Then Jocelyn and I have what we call the catalyst. Something happened in your life that made you make a change, okay? This could be good or bad. It's not always a bad thing. A good buddy of mine, Mark Mason of the Moonlighting on the Internet podcast, awesome guy. We were eating lunch together one day, and he said something really super interesting, man. I love it. He said, Shane, everybody is running from something or towards something. I was like, oh, that's deep. That's good. That's the catalyst, right? You want to dig into what made you be a writer? What turned you into an entrepreneur? What made you want to be an Olympic sprinter? What made you want to be a 7th grade defensive football coach, right? Like, what was the catalyst that made you get involved? Okay. What are you running toward or what are you running from? My catalyst for me was my son in that daycare center, like that boss telling me, no, you got to handle your personal problems after work. That was my catalyst. I was running from that job. A friend of mine, she started a business and she wanted to homeschool her kids. That was her catalyst. That was her running toward, right? It was a dream. So you got to pull people's catalyst out of them. Okay. Now, from that point on, this is a cool thing I learned in the way Pixar makes movies. You want to pull out at least 3 more parts of their story, and you just want to keep building on the catalyst. So, oh, the catalyst happened. That thing happened to you. So because of that, what happened next? Right? That's all you got to say to people. Like, ooh, that happened. What happened next? So they'll tell you, because my boss told me no, what happened next? I started researching businesses and I failed miserably at offline businesses. And then you stop and you say, ooh, because of that, what happened next? You say, well, I got online and I started looking for online businesses. Ooh, because of that, what happened next? Well, I finally launched an online business that was successful and we made enough money to quit our jobs. Bam. We have used the because of that, what happened next framework to get to, right, the place where we need to be, the moral of the story, the conclusion of the story, of this particular story. It's just like reading through the Bible. A lot of people will read through the Bible. They'll bounce around topical. There's nothing wrong with that. And then a lot of pastors will teach through the Bible like in sequential order, like I think it's called exponential. I don't know. I'm saying this word terribly wrong. Pastors out there, please don't correct me on this one. They read it in order, okay? Because it builds on it. It's like, oh, well, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Ooh, because of that, what happened next? Ooh, God was already in creation. So he said, I'm going to create the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, right? Like you're reading through a story in the order that it happened. Keep people on their railroad track. And what you will do, what your goal here is in storytelling, in this framework, is to reveal fears and obstacles that this person faced and overcame, right? The fears and the obstacles are the meat of the story. Like who were the people and the things that tried to hold them back, right? Because of that, what happened next? And you can even pause if someone's just saying, well, I just went straight to success. Say, no. Because you did this, what was the next challenge you faced? Because of this, what happened next? You can take people through their story in a better way than they can even write it down. You can do this with your own story. Like I was going to tell any story, right? If I was going to tell the story of how I went from an 0-10 football coach to a football coach who could actually win more games on Friday night every year than they lost, I would start with the catalyst. The catalyst was, or I would start in the past. I would say, I was at home and I was working in insurance and I just wanted to do something more with my life. I was, working for my dad. I was selling insurance and, I just wanted to do something bigger. And I really, when I was a kid, late in my high school career, I got hurt and I didn't get to finish my senior season. And I always missed football. And I thought, wow, being a football coach, I would get football back. Bam. That plants the seed for the catalyst, which was I'd had enough, right? Bam. I went out and I tried to be a football coach. And then I tell the story. Because of that, I went to a school and got a job. Because of that, I met a coach and got a college job. Because of that, I got another college job. Because of that, I finally got a head coaching job. So I can tell this story in sequential order, starting from the once upon a time, going through the catalyst, and then saying, because of that, what happened next? Eventually, you got to wrap up the story. You got to know where you're going, right? So, when I was talking to Priscilla Shire, I really wanted to unpack the story of her being a writer. Like, why writing? Like, why, of all things, why writing? You're a great speaker. You've got all these other talents, awesome actress. Why writing? Why do you write so many books? So that was the story I wanted to get to. So when I got to the place of basically why she became a writer, how she went through the writing process, and now how does her writing career look today, I've concluded that part of the story. I don't need to tell every part of Priscilla Shire's story forever, right? I just have to get to a place where I've got a conclusion. And then when you get to a conclusion of that story, you can kind of sum it up, right? We call it the epilogue, okay? So if the once upon a time is like the prologue of the story, the epilogue is at the end. And Pixar words this in a really interesting way. They say, and ever since then, life has been ... So you go out and you ask people like, man, since your writing career took off, how's life been? Oh, it's crazy. It's this, it's that, and the other. And that sums it up. It gives it a conclusion where you can at least end this chapter of the journey. Okay. And all podcasts should end with a call to action. So every story leads to a call to action, and you spend that call to action back to whatever you're selling. So that's pretty much how we do it. Like this prologue format with a catalyst. Because of that, what happened next? And I'll keep going down that rabbit hole. You can explore tangents in between there, but I'm trying to unpack fears and obstacles. And then I'm trying to unpack the solutions to those fears and obstacles. I'm setting the tone. I'm picking the story we're going to tell because it's my podcast. I'm taking people down this rabbit hole. That's my job, is to guide people through the story. We wrap it up with like an epilogue, and we give a call to action on how that can help other people, because the ultimate goal of our podcast is to gain influence, is to gain income, is to make an impact out in the world,